Good evening. How to deal with child criminals is one of the hardest decisions that parents and police face. No one can agree how to prevent criminality, how to handle it when it occurs. The programs in the series have shown how we've chopped and changed in our attitude to child crime. At one moment, locking people up, at another, treating them to counselling and concentrating on trying to repair the damage done to them in childhood, and quite often a combination of the two. Well, now we have a new approach. The Home Secretary, Jack Straw, is bringing in new laws which will require, among other things, parents to take more responsibility for their children's actions and to face penalties if they don't. They'll also require children to take responsibility, to face up to the consequences of what they've done. Now, with me here to talk about these things are some of the people who appeared in the films and others who have direct experience of child offenders. And the first thing I want to talk about is the question of whether the problem itself is worse than it was, say, 10 or 20 years ago. The Bulger murder, the Mary Bell case, the first two films in the series, were a reminder of the kind of depths to which children can sink. But is the general level of violent behaviour among children, as we saw in that last film, that's what it suggested, is the general level getting worse? Christian Williams, you were an offender, not now. What do you think? Do you think behaviour among children, general criminal behaviour, is worsening?
I certainly think that the public's perception of it is greater than what it was. But I would say, yes, there is a general trend, really, in the growing violence that you see around you. And certainly in my experience, things were becoming more violent as I grew older and older.
Right. Lynn Rickard, you had the most appalling experience when your son was murdered. Do you feel now, looking back on that this is a new, horrendous kind of crime that is being committed? And do you see it as part of a general decline in standards among young people?
Well, I never knew there was gangs, certainly not in schools. And in the area that I come from, within the past 18 months, there's actually been 3 murders.
By young people?
By young people.
And to you, I mean, if you look back to your childhood, was it inconceivable that this kind of thing would happen?
I never knew. Well, when I was young, there was no killings. We'd fight as kids fight. That was fists and feet. There was no weapons used. And to my knowledge, there was no gangs. We hung around in groups. Like, girls would stick together and the boys would stick together, but there was no gangs.
Phil Taylor, you've for 10 years run a Manchester school. Do you see an overall problem that's arisen in recent years about young offenders?
It's very hard to say whether the situation is getting worse because all of us are probably only aware of one particular area. But one thing I think has been noticeable over the past 10 years is the extent to which parental authority has often been eroded, and it's common now to find parents who really can't cope with their own children.
But do you remember 10 years ago the sort of thing happening that happened to Lynn Rickard's son, of people with knives and machetes, and children actually killing other children in fights?
I think there have always been a number of those cases, but possibly things have got more extreme. But you see, I think you have to go back further. When Lynn was talking about the way it used to be just fists and feet, I think you've got to put a stop to the fists and the feet. And I think, the first point that you've got to make in a school is that violence is unacceptable. And that's what we've certainly tried to do in our school.
John Pitts, do we have a problem?
Yes, I think we do. The overall crime rate rose by about 100% between the late 70s and the mid-1990s. And within that, we found crime being concentrated in areas of very high social deprivation. I think as well that there were more weapons used in offences committed by youngsters. And then in addition, of course, was the growth in the use of drugs.
So what are we actually talking about when we're trying to concentrate on reducing crime? What kind of young crime is it that we ought to be concentrating on? Is it a small number of people, or is it the growth of crime among a large number of people?
No, I think if you look at the data, it suggests that smaller numbers of it, through the 80s anyway, smaller numbers of youngsters appeared to be committing more crime, and that those youngsters were located in particular kinds of neighbourhoods. So I think one of the things that we probably have to do, and I think to an extent the government are doing, is to focus on high crime neighbourhoods where the crime tends to be, if you like, implosive. It tends to be neighbour upon neighbour, young person upon young person.
Robin Searle, from your point of view as a police officer, have you seen a marked deterioration?
Yes.
The film suggests there is.
Yes, there's been an increase in juvenile crime, and I think the behaviour of young people will reflect society, and society is getting more violent. I think the problem with the repetitive and persistent offenders is that the system has not been allowed to deal with them, and they have graduated through criminality. They've gone from fairly minor offences through to more serious offences, up to the very heinous crimes like the murder of your son. And I think that has been the problem. What needs to occur now is that there's got to be a far earlier intervention, and there's got to be an early identification of risk factors with these children coming through the system.
And do you see the very violent activity, like the murder, as springing from the same causes that have led to an increase in juvenile crime, in car theft, in robbery, and all those sort of things? Is it part of the same thing, or is it a separate and quite different?
Well, I think it's a culture that's grown up within youth today, and not all children are like that, not all young people are like that, but there is a certain culture, this gang culture, that is beginning to develop, something that only a few years ago was unheard of. So I think it is separate to the general run-of-the-mill children that come into the criminal justice system and work their way out.
Jack Straw, is there anything you particularly want to point out in that general agreement that there is a rise in crime and a rise in some of the most serious and violent crime?
Well, I think John Pitts and Robin Searle are both right. You've got a situation where crimes tended to be concentrated in these high crime neighbourhoods. Probably no more offenders, maybe fewer, but committing many more crimes and getting into a degree of organisation, often, but not exclusively, tied up with drugs. And Robin is, of course, right to say that what has happened is there's an easy graduation from relatively minor crime to major and violent crime, and there aren't sufficient checks to stop or seek to stop the commission of these crimes within the current system.
Okay, well, let's turn to that, because, of course, the work of those of you here involved in protecting us from youth crime and in the world at large would be much simpler if it were possible to spot who might turn to crime before they offended. If you could actually tell which unhappy child or which truant would end up killing James Bulger. It was an issue that was raised in the first film in this series, which asked whether it would have been possible to spot and prevent Robert Thompson and John Venables committing their terrible crime.
Robert Thompson is the little boy circled. What shocks is his size and childishness. His family life was unhappy. A social work report after the killing revealed that his father was a violent drunk who had disappeared. His mother had subsequently attempted suicide. She too drank heavily. He was the fifth of 7 brothers who grew up afraid of each other. It was alleged that they assaulted and tied each other up. John Venables came from a more secure home, but something was wrong and his education was failing. A teacher from his previous school wrote a report in which she described his disturbed behaviour, how, among other things, he attacked other children, hung himself upside down from coat pegs, lay under chairs, and stuck paper all over his face.
I think we interviewed and arrested about 60 boys. And some of the background of these boys was unbelievable. And I don't think from the research I did with the school and with the families that this ever became evident from either John Venables or Robert Thompson. There was nothing to suggest in their background that they could carry out the horrific injuries that they actually did.
Eileen Vizard, 60 children who appeared to be at risk, but those 2 they didn't think were at risk. Can you tell who is at risk and target them and try to make sure they don't offend?
Well, I think we can actually make some progress in this area. I don't know that I would agree with that statement. I think we have to remember that the laws of evidence in criminal trials do not always allow full background to come out in a way that might add a clear explanation. Most of the young abusers and offenders that I deal with have got backgrounds that are full of trauma, full of parental neglect, full of family problems, and many of these problems have been documented at school. Agencies have been concerned about these children for a long time, and what one finds is that by the time they are referred, they come with very fat files in which it's all written down, but actually very little has been done. People seem to be frightened to make a referral to a health agency for an opinion that might lead to services and might perhaps prevent some of this delinquent behaviour.
Louise Chase, your daughter, sitting beside you here, gave you trouble.
Yes.
Did you spot that early on? Did you see signs in her?
I did see signs, yes. I did take it later on to health professionals, education welfare people. By that time, it was beyond being stopped, and nobody recognised that she was showing classic signs of having attention deficit disorder.
Jessica, did you offend, actually? Were you an offender?
Not as such, but I got into bad ways. I did things that were not good for me, that didn't help me or benefit me. I truanted from school. I left school when I was 15. I missed out on doing my GCSEs. I missed a great part of my life because no one took any notice. I was showing signs of, this classic thing, ADD, and no one was taking any notice of me.
Charlie Bowman, you were Nathan, the boy, the first part of that film's social worker. If you take an example like Jessica's there, can you actually distinguish sufficiently usefully for the purposes of stopping children committing crimes those who are likely to? Or is it too big a group of people? Like her?
I think that in terms of identifying particular individuals, it is very difficult. And I think one of the things that I know we as a local authority are putting emphasis on is early years work. And so making services much more readily available to families of with younger children. And in that sense, by doing that, you hope to sort of capture those young people or children, young people who may grow up to become offenders.
There was a very interesting example, wasn't there, in Newcastle, that the boy who was actually, I think, called by the police, not by the newspapers for once, Rat Boy. Do you remember the example of Rat Boy who did committed 150 offences or something? They looked at his family, and he was the only one in what was otherwise a beautifully conducted family, well ordered, who committed crime. And yet he was completely out of control. Now, the normal way of looking, the things you were talking about, of looking for disturbed children, disturbed families, difficult family backgrounds, wouldn't work, would it?
No, I mean, I think the important issue really is for a good communication between agencies, so that if a concern is identified with particular young people, that there are forums for agencies to come together and say, right, what actually does need to be done for this young person, this family, rather than actually necessarily trying to predict who is going to offend and who isn't. So it is that prevention that actually needs to be there. And I think the point that's been made about youth justice services such as our own, we do come into the picture probably far too late. So it is as Christian was saying earlier, it's important that we are available for families and for the children, young people.
But obviously if you could do things earlier, you might prevent crime. But Oliver James, do you think you can accurately spot children at an early age who may be in trouble?
It's very widely agreed that you can predict with about an 80% accuracy which children will be the criminals. And obviously that leaves 20% you can't predict. But I don't think there's any doubt now that violence anyway is not caused by genes, that it is caused by the way parents treat their children. The difference between most violence is done by poor young males. The difference between a poor young man who's violent and one who isn't is that he was beaten up as a child, often dressed up as punishment, inconsistent punishment, parental disharmony, witnessing that, often the dad hitting the mum, and irritability in the mother, particularly depression, caused by depression. Now, I mean, when you've got all those three factors present, there's a very good Home Office study that followed children from 8 to 32, 405 children, and it predicts, with a pretty good accuracy which ones are going to be. So prevention, now if you could, the point is that the Home Office have known this for a long time, and Jack Straw knows this very well, and in an ideal world, what you'd do is you'd find the 6% of boys who commit 45% of crime. You'd find those boys and those families, and you easily could. But, we live in a free society, and also there's a question of resources. But in an ideal world, you'd mount a Head Start American program into massive intervention.
And of course, they're not all boys, because Kirsty Scull, you were...
Nearly all of them are boys.
You were an offender. Look, you now work with children who are in trouble or need help. When you look back on your own childhood, did you spot in it something? Now that you can look at it objectively, it's behind you. Can you look back and see something that would have led people to help you and prevent the trouble you got into happening?
Not at a very early age. I think the time that I myself spotted it was when I was about 12. Was my attitude totally changed.
You didn't turn to anybody for help? But could somebody have spotted that you were in trouble, do you think, at school?
Yes.
And they didn't?
No.
Phil Taylor, just briefly, you have hundreds of boys and girls. Is it possible to spot in the way that Oliver James is saying?
Absolutely. And I think what we're ducking here is the resource issue. Time and time again, we come across young people who have serious problems of the kind that Oliver James has spoken about. And we look around desperately for somebody who can help them, some agency that can help the parents to be better parents. And mostly those agencies don't exist. The resource isn't there.
I think it's worth saying as well that, it's quite clear that society, the thing that predicts rates of violence across states within the United States is the amount of inequality and the amount of support. Likewise within Europe, and if you look at somewhere like Scandinavia, like Denmark, only has 4% of its population is on a low income. Now, obviously, New Labour, it's a wonderful thing that we've got a government that actually registers this and acknowledges it and is going to try and do something about it.
Well, we'll talk about what the government is going to try and do and whether it will work right now, because the last programme in the series, the one shown just now, described the efforts of parents to control a young offender called Nathan. And in the pipeline are laws which will allow courts to do various things they can't do at the moment, to impose curfews, to put control orders on children, to impose classes in parenting on parents. This is an approach that's supported not just by the new government, but also by opposition parties, though in some cases with reservations.
We believe in parental control orders, so that courts could impose them on the parents of children whom they believe could keep control of their children, but were refusing to do so. We believe in giving the courts power to impose speedy sanctions on youngsters, including, wherever possible, an element of reparation to the victim.
We fully support developing parental support, education in parenting, help for parents. We believe in parental responsibility. But the government runs the risk of fining and ultimately imprisoning law-abiding parents for the actions of out-of-control children, while finding that the orders are useless in dealing with those parents who are themselves the cause of the young person's problems, of whom the young person may in effect be escaping in some of their criminal activities.
And is it anyway right for the state to interfere in family life, not just where crimes have been committed by children, but also where it thinks there may be a risk of crimes being committed, which is one of the things that's in the bill? Louise Chase, just tell us what you do, because you're on a parent line, helpline. Yes. I mean, people don't have much idea what these parenting classes, which parents can be ordered to go to if they fail in their responsibilities, will do. How do you get through to the parent? What do you talk to them about?
Well,
just briefly.
Parents ring us up about various matters that's stressing them with their children, quite often teenagers. We try and support them. If I haven't actually done parenting classes, I can see the value of them. I don't think forcing them.
Jack Straw, what will a parenting class involve?
Parenting class will involve counselling by people who are professionals in this area about the nature of parenting, and picking up a point that was made earlier, I think by Phil Taylor or Charlie Beaumont. It's about explaining to parents the problems that are caused from inconsistent parenting. One of the major problems that all of us who are parents face is that we sometimes blow hot and cold, and that's a kind of natural reaction. But if you blow hot and cold too much, too fast, then the kids don't know where the boundaries are. And if I'm asked to specify one problem that these offenders face, it is that they don't understand that there are limits to the behaviour. I mean, I think that Kirsty, I was picking up from her a sense that when she started to get out of control, she found that very frightening. I think that's right, Kirsty, isn't it? Because you're a kid. You may be 12, you may be really grown up, but you are only 12, and you want adults to say, these are the boundaries. And not we're going to beat you up if you go over the boundaries, but we're going to seek to correct you and support you.
This teaching of parenting is something you think you can teach across the whole society, ethnic minorities, everybody, a standard way of looking after children.
Well, I don't think you should single out ethnic minorities.
No, I'm saying including that.
Well, of course.
People have different ways of parenting.
Well, of course they do, but I mean,
there's
no single way of parenting. But what I'm utterly convinced about is that parenting has public consequences, and therefore ought to be the subject of public discussion. And simply before even this bill is law, at long last, there is now serious discussion about parenting and some of its public consequences.
Do any of you have doubts about that idea, or are you all in support of it? Yes?
Well, what I would like to say is that, I mean, I've been a social worker now for about 20 years, and most parents that I work with actually are exceedingly responsible. But I think it links with the points being made by Phil Taylor, is that where actually do they go sometimes to get the support that they need? They then become very frustrated, demoralised, and that's when the quality of their parenting can go right down. Also, I think there is an issue about who actually are the parents, because many of the young people that we work with have reconstituted families, so that you have mum or dad living somewhere else. You may have had 2 or 3 father figures in the home, and that's where the difficulty is. Who do we as social workers target our efforts on?
Is it practical, Phil Taylor?
Is what practical?
Is it practical to have this parenting classes imposed on parents?
Well, one of the problems with many of the proposals is what do you do if people don't cooperate? I mean, all the way through, you've got these orders and people are supposed to do things. Well, for instance, parents are supposed to send their kids to school. Many of them don't. And very, very little actually happens to those who don't.
Many of them don't, and that's because of a lack of enforcement. But whereas, for example, in Lewisham, you had a period of effective enforcement, both counselling of parents whose kids were truanting, but also taking them to court more swiftly, you found a high level of compliance.
Yeah, but hang on, Home Secretary, we're not talking here about a nice social service provided for some parents. No, we're talking about you as government insisting that certain parents undertake parenting, and you'll punish them if they refuse.
We're talking about the courts, not me as Home Secretary. There is a big difference. We're talking about the courts in appropriate circumstances where they believe that having a parenting order would make a difference, actually imposing one. Now, in many cases, I mean, again, picking up what Charlie has said, you find, I very rarely come across a parent, in all my time as a politician and as a school governor, sitting on exclusion panels, where the parents are simply not interested at all in their kids. I've come across plenty of parents who are very frustrated and demoralised.
What, and you think on the whole people would like help?
Yes, and I can tell you this, that the germ of the idea for the parenting order came from a very long discussion I had with a mother of by then an adult offender, who said to me, Mr. Straw, if only somebody had been able to see my needs as a parent and had given me some advice, I wouldn't have minded. Okay. By a court order, I would have found life a lot better.
Gordon, you've got a lot of experience as a social worker. You've been one for 20 years. You've also been in trouble as a young boy. What do you think? Do you think it'll work? Would it have worked in your case?
Well, things like this will always work with some people. Yeah, that's right. There'll always be some, but you've got the 20% at the top and 20% at the bottom, because what you've got to realise is some families living in incredible deprivation, years of deprivation, on what we call sink estates, with kids and landings where everyone's in the same sink. If you're going to now come and impose on people like that, who have had no control over their lives practically since they were born, it's become the cycle of poverty, the cycle of deprivation. How are you going to punish them?
Well, what are you going to punish them with? But in many cases, I mean, I know these families, they themselves as adults also want to know where the boundaries are. They want advice and guidance about the rules that they can give their children, because they will have been in the same kind of poor parenting situation. So one way or another, we've got to break out of this. And let me say, I know, inevitably the Home Office is portrayed as the Department of Punitive Affairs. But what we're doing here within the Home Office is part of a much wider programme of trying to deal with social exclusion.
But what
getting to the kids at a much earlier age.
There are parents who just can't intellectualise it, like the way we're sitting here doing it.
No, I know they're not, but I'm not suggesting they should. But they do understand the benefits of support, benefits of clearer rules, for example, about what time their kids should be inside.
What will you do if they don't cooperate?
Well,
he won't, but the courts will have the power to fine. It's quite simple. It's a matter of fact. You'll have the power to fine parents, and if they don't pay their fine, they will go to jail.
Well, that's very, very unlikely.
It's not a question of whether it's unlikely or not. It's a question of whether it's part of the law.
It is part of the law, and
they can be fined and jailed.
My anticipation is that the courts will use this power sensibly, and very, very few parents will end up being fined for a breach.
I want to move on to another point that's come up in this bill, and it was in these films too. The dramatic events surrounding the serialisation of the book as well on Mary Bell, highlighted a particular aspect of child crime, which I want to talk about. Mary Bell killed when she was 11 years old, and the question is whether she knew that what she was doing was seriously wrong. Until now, the courts have assumed that children under 14 don't know, and the government says that this flies in the face of common sense, and that children over 10 must in future be assumed to know the difference between being naughty and serious wrongdoing, as they put it. A change, of course, which would make it easier to both prosecute and to punish the young. Presumably, that's what's behind it. Are you in favour of this change? And is it a major change, or is it just a tinkering?
Well, I'm in favour of it in the sense that the existing provision doesn't really make a lot of sense in any event. What does concern me, though, is how we deal with vulnerable child defendants who come before the courts, where there may be an area of learning disability, they may have emotional problems. All these things affect that child's capacity to really understand whether what they've done is wrong and to what extent. And I'm concerned, therefore, as to who is actually going to give an opinion on that child's understanding of right and wrong.
But is it a major shift, saying 10-year-olds must take responsibility unless it can be shown otherwise?
In some ways, it's meaningless to set an age limit at all, because I think obviously one's got to look at the circumstances around each individual child, one's got to look at the child's level of understanding and emotional development, and that needs to actually occur.
Robin Searle, from your point of view as a police officer, is it going to make a big difference to you, this?
Well, it will make a difference because it will shift the weight of evidence. I think what needs to be shown, in fairness to the young children, is that there is support for them and the courts are properly constructed to deal with this change of emphasis, because they are only young children, but a lot of them are able to know the difference between right and wrong, and they are committing serious offences. And I think that the law has to give the courts the power, but the balance of power has to be with the court.
John Pitts, you in favour of the change? 10-year-olds being assumed to know the difference?
Yes, I mean, I think children from the age of 2 or 3 know the difference. It's a question of guilty intent, isn't it? And it also seems to me that when we compare ourselves with the rest of Europe, and now that includes Ireland as well, we find ourselves with the lowest age of criminal responsibility in Europe. I think it's a retrograde step, and I can't see how this will benefit us at all. Most of the research undertaken in the United States, which is where this idea comes from, seems to suggest that putting children into an adult jurisdiction actually doesn't make a lot of difference.
Okay, well, let's move on now to the general approach that the Home Office and Jack Straw in this bill is putting forward. What is the way forward? Does it have any better hope of success than previous approaches? We saw tonight that, you can try the tough regime of the approved schools of the 50s and the 60s, and then there's a softer approach that began to predominate, the social worker approach, in the 70s, and both, according to the film, now abandoned as failures.
Almost all the boys came from poor backgrounds. The hope was that the benefits of a strict but healthy regime would undo the damage done to them at home. Yet few of those in charge had childcare or teaching qualifications.
Forward! Big! Press them back! The front rank turn into
In the permissive 60s, the approved school's simple faith in discipline and exercise seemed out of touch and old-fashioned. More and more boys simply ran away home at the first possible opportunity.
Liven it up, come on, follow it on.
And in 1967, a scandal at Court Lees approved school in Surrey put an end to sending boys away for minor crimes. The masters ruled with the cane. Boys were flogged for the slightest misdemeanour.
You'd get anything from 6 to 12 strokes. When you came out, 9 out of 10 times you went to sick bay and spent the next few days on your stomach because, you was cut that bad or marked that badly. And they'd always find an excuse if you had been caned, if you had a visit from your parents or anything like that, to cancel it until the marks healed up.
At the beginning of the 70s, the pendulum swung away from punishment to care and understanding. The belief was that troublemakers were more likely to be put right in the community rather than away from home. Only the most disturbed or delinquent boys and girls would be sent to new treatment centres. Social workers and specialists were recruited to care for them.
Okay, lads, Eddie, you still to pay me the 4?
At Aycliffe in County Durham, the belief was always that disturbed children needed to be cured of their problems by care rather than punishment. Good behaviour was rewarded, and staff did their best to help the most troubled. But many of the children were so deeply scarred that they never could make a relationship with adults.
There was the staff world and the kids' world. Our picture of the kids was that they were dangerous, out to get us, that they would tear us apart if we let them. Now, the kids, on the other hand, they perceived the staff as nasty, manipulative, cheating, always cheating. They could never trust anything that we would have to say.
Well, now the pendulum is swinging again, perhaps back the other way, because the plan now is to build more jails for the young. From the autumn, serious offenders as young as 12 can be locked up. There's also going to be a new system of final warnings instead of the famous cautions given by the police. New curfews, restrictions for children under 10, young criminals having to make amends for their offences to their victims. And the question is, of course, whether all this will work and be seen to work where past regimes have failed. Norman Brennan, what do you think of the new proposals that are being put forward?
Well, as far as the offender meeting the victim is concerned, I must admit, all the thousands of victims I've dealt with, I can't really see this working. Sadly, there has been a terrible decline in young offending over the past 20 years, and many, many young offenders have a brazen, arrogant attitude towards authority figures, the police, head teachers, and sadly, and something that must concern us all, their own parents. Now, when I've gone round parents' houses, and with a robber, perhaps 14 years of age, I've looked at mum, and mum has given us exactly the same attitude that the youngster has done. And we've looked at the other young children, and in the patrol car back to the police station, we thought, we're going to be arresting him soon, we're going to be arresting her soon, because we can see what's actually coming. Now, actually, the victim meeting the offender, many victims don't wish to meet the offender. What they want is the law to protect them. They want the law to punish those offending. But many victims do support the offender being helped in prison or in the community where necessary.
So why are you putting so much confidence in the idea of the offender meeting the victim?
Well, only when the victim wants it. I mean, I wouldn't dream of securing a situation where the victim was forced to meet the offender. But what we have got to do, David, is get across to the offenders that there are victims and the victim is not the offender. And if you sit in a youth court at the moment, as I've done, the offender gets at best the idea that they are a kind of neutral spectator to a piece of adult theatre which is nothing whatever to do with them. And the offender may go to court 3 or 4 times and in the end wonder what the devil's going on unless and until they're sent away, which in a sense represents a failure by the system. So we've got to get across, first of all, there are consequences for bad behaviour. Secondly, that there are victims and the victim is not the offender. One way of doing that, where the victim wishes it, is for the victim to be confronted with the offender and then for the offender to make reparation to the victim. Okay.
John Pitts, what about the increase in custodial sentences, what you might call them prisons for the 12-year-olds? I know not technically called that. Is this the right approach?
I think it's quite a worrying approach in the sense that I think a lot of your policy says we will intervene early. We will knock out quite a few of the stages that people pass through so they know we mean business. And I think there's a lot to be said for that. The problem with that, I think, which I don't think has been anticipated, is it drags youngsters to the gates of the institution far quicker. Now, on the basis of what we know about institutions, I think of the successive reports of chief inspectors of prisons about young offender establishments. I think of what we've learnt recently about Redbank, Mary Bell's time in Redbank. What we know about residential care in North Wales gives me no confidence whatsoever in that current policies will do anything about that.
Could I ask you this, John? Because in the film about Nathan, there was a young offender who became an old offender who finally went to prison at the age of 18 or 19, saying if only his behaviour had been checked at an earlier age. And I meet so many people in young offenders institutions who say to me, if I'd been taken out of the environment at an earlier stage and given effective treatment within a custodial setting, I might not have gone wrong as badly as I did later.
I'm a little bit concerned about the statement that offenders aren't victims. I mean, that may be true for many, but for some seriously disturbed offenders, they are indeed victims.
And what do you think of the balance of what's being proposed?
Well, I think we need to bring in the health and the child welfare element far more, because many young offenders who are victims are also children in need in terms of the Children Act.
Are you against the headline things, the idea of curfews, the idea of children being accompanied to school, the idea of parents taking responsibility, the 12-year-old prisons? Are you against those toughening up, if you like, in the way that they're treated?
I'm not against them in principle, as long as they link very firmly with the welfare side, notably the provisions of the Children Act.
Well, I think Jack Straw's got 2 incredibly difficult problems that he's inherited. One is an enormous increase in crime generally since 1950. The other is the legacy of Thatcherism, which is a massive increase in violence. Now, he's trying to do prevention, and I think he'll come to that more later on. But at the moment, he's trying to send out a message. Parenting classes the idea of detention centres. These things send out a message. They won't work for lots of the children, but at least it's saying we mean business.
Christian Williams, would you have been, if you lived under this, would you have not offended at all at 7, 8, 10, 11, whenever it was that you were? Or less?
Well, I don't think any of the measures which I've heard suggested today would really have made that much difference
Why not?
to me. What you seem to be missing all the way through this debate is emphasis upon the individuals who actually come into contact with young people. You're talking about doing things to people, young people. You should be doing them with young people.